Don't come any closer. I don't need a pour into my wedding. Her voice cut through the snow-covered station, sharp enough to draw blood. Strangers froze, phones lifted, and in that silence I felt 40 years of sacrifice vanish. Before we dive into how it came to this, if you believe karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Snow fell in heavy sheets outside the station, muffling the city in white silence. But inside the hall everything was sharp. The hiss of brakes, the echo of footsteps, the hum of strangers moving past one another. I stood near the platform, my old leather suitcase by my side, the one I had carried since my earliest trials in court. Today, I was not a lawyer. I was simply a father, on his way to his only daughter's wedding. My chest swelled with pride, even as age and loneliness weighed on my shoulders. Then she appeared. Rebecca, my Rebecca, now 35, radiant in her tailored coat, her diamond ring catching every fluorescent light. She walked toward me, not with the warmth I remembered, but with a stare that froze the air between us. Her heels struck the marble like a drumbeat of judgment. She stopped only a few steps away and spoke words that cut deeper than any cross-examination I had ever faced in court. Don't come any closer. I don't need a poor, washed-up man dragging his failure into my wedding. The crowd shifted, conversations hushed. A young couple turned to watch, while a businessman lowered his newspaper. Phones rose, screens glowing, recording the scene as if my humiliation were a performance for them. I gripped the handle of my suitcase tighter, my knuckles white, my body frozen. 40 years of sacrifice, every night I had worked, every case I had turned down, every piece of myself I had sold away for her dreams, vanished in a single sentence. The snow outside was bitter, but it was nothing compared to the frost in her eyes. Time didn't just slow, it stopped, and in that stillness, betrayal carved its first scar. Rebecca wasn't always this way. There was a time when her smile was my entire world, when her laughter could fill our home with light even in the darkest winters. I remember tucking her in as a child, her tiny fingers clutching my sleeve, whispering, "Don't leave, Dad," and I never did. I stayed, through sickness, through grief, through the aching silence after her mother's passing. Every choice I made, every case I took, every dollar I saved was for her. When she grew older, her needs grew bigger, but I never hesitated. I sold my beloved vintage car to cover her tuition. I took late-night consultations, sacrificing sleep and health, just to make sure her rent was paid and her textbooks arrived on time. The world saw me as a capable lawyer, but Rebecca saw me as a constant, her anchor, her provider, her shield, and I embraced that role without complaint. At her law school graduation, I cheered louder than anyone, clapping until my palms stung, tears burning in my eyes. When she turned the key to her first apartment, a gift I had stretched myself thin to buy, I felt pride swell in my chest. She was stepping into her own life, but in truth, every brick, every nail, every corner of that space had been carved out of my sacrifices. I told myself it was worth it. Every sleepless night, every risk, every treasure I let go of from my own youth. For Rebecca's future, I convinced myself I could live without anything except her love, and that, I thought, would never vanish. But as I would soon learn, even the deepest devotion can be rewritten, erased, forgotten, when ambition and pride take root, where gratitude should have grown. The sacrifices didn't end with tuition or rent. When Rebecca dreamed of starting her own company, I saw the fire in her eyes, and I couldn't deny her. She wanted to build something, to prove herself, and I wanted her to soar without the weight of debt crushing her spirit. So I opened the old cedar chest in my study and sold the treasures of my past, my prized stamp collection, handed down from my father, each piece a memory of boyhood afternoons spent learning patience and precision, gone in one swift decision, so she could have capital for her launch. Later, when the business hit its first storm, she came to me with tears. Banks refused her. Investors turned cold. I didn't hesitate. I sold my classic car, the one I had polished every Sunday for 30 years, the one her mother loved riding in on summer evenings. Watching it drive away nearly tore something from my chest. But I told myself, this is what fathers do. Her company survived. It even grew, and she smiled at me again, for a while. Those fleeting moments of her gratitude were enough to make me forget the hollowed-out spaces in my own life. I told myself that one day she would understand, that one day she would look back and see not just the money, not just the sacrifices, but the love carved into each decision. But love, I would later learn, has a short memory when wealth and pride arrive at the door. The very things I gave up to build her future would become the reasons she buried me in her past. Part 1.4. The first real crack appeared when Rebecca brought Nathaniel into our lives. He was the son of a wealthy, powerful family, sharp suit, sharper smile. I remember the night she introduced him. Her hand looped proudly through his arm as if she had already stepped into a different world. He shook my hand with a grip too firm, too rehearsed, and I felt a distance in his eyes, as though he was already measuring how little I mattered. At first, I told myself this was just the nervousness of a father meeting the man who would take his daughter's hand. But slowly, I began to see Rebecca's changes. Calls that used to last an hour were cut to a few rushed minutes. Family dinners became rare, then non-existent. She began to cancel visits, always with some polished excuse. Nathaniel's influence grew quietly but quickly. Rebecca's tone hardened, her laughter around me thinned, her words sharpened when I asked about her life. Once, at a dinner with his friends, she introduced me not as my father, but as Henry, just Henry. As if stripping the word dad away could erase the years I had lived for her. I smiled through it. I told myself it was a phase, that love was making her careless, that she would come back. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. My daughter was slipping into a world where I had no seat, no voice, no name. And though I didn't say it then, I felt the first chill of what was to come, the slow, deliberate erasure of a father from his child's life. The first real crack appeared when Rebecca brought Nathaniel into our lives. He was the son of a wealthy, powerful family, sharp suit, sharper smile. I remember the night she introduced him, her hand looped proudly through his arm, as if she had already stepped into a different world. He shook my hand with a grip too firm, too rehearsed, and I felt a distance in his eyes, as though he was already measuring how little I mattered. At first, I told myself this was just the nervousness of a father meeting the man who would take his daughter's hand, but slowly I began to see Rebecca's changes. Calls that used to last an hour were cut to a few rushed minutes. Family dinners became rare, then non-existent. She began to cancel visits, always with some polished excuse. Nathaniel's influence grew quietly but quickly. Rebecca's tone hardened, her laughter around me thinned, her words sharpened when I asked about her life. Once, at a dinner with his friends, she introduced me not as my father, but as Henry, just Henry. As if stripping the word dad away could erase the years I had lived for her. I smiled through it. I told myself it was a phase, that love was making her careless, that she would come back. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. My daughter was slipping into a world where I had no seat, no voice, no name, and though I didn't say it then, I felt the first chill of what was to come, the slow, deliberate erasure of a father from his child's life. The train station was not the first wound, but it was the deepest. That morning, I believed I was simply catching a train to attend my daughter's wedding, suitcase in hand, heart heavy with memories yet still full of pride. Instead, I was summoned there to be cast out. Rebecca's words did not just reject me from her ceremony, they exiled me from her life. When she spat those sentences, her voice echoing through the marble halls, the silence of the crowd was louder than any verdict I had ever heard in court. No one stepped forward. No one defended me. Strangers recorded my humiliation as if it were entertainment. I was not a father in their eyes that day. I was a spectacle. I stood frozen, watching her turn and walk away, her heels striking against the floor like nails sealing a coffin. The ring on her finger glinted under the station lights, and I realized it wasn't just love she had chosen, it was a world that demanded my absence. The snow outside kept falling, relentless, blanketing the city in white. But I felt no purity in it, only cold, only silence. And in that silence, I knew something had broken beyond repair. The girl I had raised, the daughter I had sacrificed my life for, had buried me in the snow long before the train ever arrived. That night I sat alone in my study, lights low, the window pane filmed with frost. The city was quiet under a hush of snow, but inside my chest the station kept echoing her words, ricocheting like metal against bone. I pulled the old wool blanket over my knees, set the kettle on, and reached for the leather file, where I kept the fragments of a life. Photographs, report cards, hospital bracelets, letters written in a child's round hand. Memory has its own cross-examination. It asks without mercy. I remembered the fevers, how I learned to measure time by the rhythm of a child's breathing, by the rise and fall that told me whether fear could sleep for one night. I would tiptoe to her doorway, hold a cool cloth across her brow, Whisper courtroom stories turned into bedtime fables, villains confounded, truth restored, the good walking home in morning light. Partners at the firm insisted I was throwing away the best years of my career. Maybe, but when she reached for my fingers and said, "Stay," I stayed. What title could outweigh a promise like that? After her mother died, our house sounded different. The floorboards creaked in a lonelier language. I burned dinners, I overwatered plants, I failed at 1,000 small domestic trials, and still, every evening we set 2 plates, and I learned to fill the silence with presence. On the worst nights, she would fold herself against my shoulder, that fragile bird of a heartbeat tapping my collarbone, and ask a question no law could answer. "You will not leave, right?" I told the truth. Number. Years moved like trains through fog arrivals, departures, long platforms of waiting. I took extra clients to pay for books, turned down a partnership to make room for school plays and dentist appointments, and spent holidays in the office so that birthdays could be extravagant. I sold pieces of my past to purchase pages of her future. I gave, and still, they wanted more. At the station, she spoke as if all that history were disposable, as if devotion had an expiration date stamped in invisible ink. It did not. It never will. But now I understood something cold and precise. Love is a vow. Gratitude is a choice. She kept the first once. She abandoned the second today. I remember the day Rebecca turned the key to her first apartment. The walls were bare. The air smelled of fresh paint, but her smile lit up every corner as though she had stepped into a palace. She didn't know how many cases I had taken on, how many hours I had stolen from sleep to afford that place. She didn't see the bills stacked like mountains on my desk, or the way my hands trembled from exhaustion when I signed the final check. All she saw was the key resting in her palm, freedom, bought with my years of labor. I told myself it was worth it. She hugged me that day, kissed my cheek, and said, "Thank you, Dad." Just 3 words, but they felt heavier than gold. I clung to that gratitude, believing it was proof that my sacrifices had meaning. Yet behind that joy was the shadow of what I gave up. The house I had promised myself to rebuild after her mother's death, gone. The vacations I had sworn I would finally take vanished. My savings dwindled into nothing more than paper trails leading straight into Rebecca's dreams. And I accepted it. I accepted it because love has no balance sheet, no line of profit or loss. Love spends itself until nothing remains but hope. I convinced myself she would remember, that when she walked across the stage at her graduation, or when she hung her law degree on the wall, she would see me in every step, every brick, every corner of her success. But memory is a fragile thing, gratitude even more so. And as years passed, I began to realize that what I saw as sacrifice, she began to see as her entitlement. The company was her next dream, one she painted with bright words and late-night calls full of ambition. She told me she wanted independence, a legacy that would be hers alone. I looked into her eyes and saw the same hunger I once carried when I was a young lawyer. How could I deny her? So I opened the cedar chest in my study, the one that smelled faintly of dust and memory, and pulled out my father's prize stamp collection. Each piece was a story afternoon spent together, lessons in patience and detail, and in one transaction, I let them all go. The money became her seed capital. When her business stumbled, as all new ventures do, she came to me in tears. Banks had closed their doors. Investors turned cold. She whispered, "Dad, I don't know what to do." And I did what fathers do, I answered. I sold my classic car, the one I had polished every Sunday, the one her mother adored riding in on summer evenings. Watching it disappear down the street felt like losing her all over again, but I told myself it was worth it. Her company survived. Then it grew. Awards, contracts, photographs in glossy magazines, Rebecca smiling as though she had conquered the world. For a brief moment, I thought she saw me. She hugged me, whispered a thank you, and I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, she understood what it cost me. But gratitude fades quickly when success takes root. What I saw as sacrifice, she began to view as obligation. And I realized, too late, that every treasure I surrendered for her dreams was not just gone, it was forgotten. I still remember the first night Nathaniel walked through my door. He wore confidence like a tailored suit, his smile polished, his handshake firm. Rebecca's eyes sparkled when she looked at him, brighter than I had ever seen, and for that reason alone I tried to welcome him. I set the table, opened a bottle of wine I had saved for years, and told myself this was a beginning, not an ending. But even then, unease gnawed at me. His gaze carried calculation, not warmth. Every word he spoke dripped with ambition, as though he wasn't simply courting my daughter, he was interviewing her for a position in his world. When I excused myself to the kitchen, I caught fragments of his voice, low and persuasive, planting seeds of superiority that would soon take root. Rebecca changed quickly after that. Phone calls grew shorter, dinners less frequent. Her laughter around me dimmed, replaced by quick sighs and polished excuses. I thought it was the intoxication of new love. I wanted to believe that once the rush settled, she would return to me, to the quiet rhythm we had built together. But she didn't. Instead, Nathaniel's presence became a wall I could not climb. I recall one evening at a gathering of his colleagues. Rebecca introduced me not as my father, but as Henry. Just Henry. My name stripped of blood, stripped of meaning. A quiet dismissal, delivered with a smile. My chest ached as the room applauded his jokes and his boasts, while I sat invisible in the corner. I left that night with my heart heavier than ever. I told myself it was a phase, that she was caught in the tide of love and wealth, that she would find her way back. But somewhere deep down I knew I was being rewritten, reduced, prepared to be erased entirely. The transformation was slow enough that, for a while, I convinced myself I was imagining it. But every gathering, every phone call, every word from Rebecca confirmed otherwise. She had begun to see me not as her father, but as an inconvenient shadow. At parties hosted by Nathaniel's family, I stood on the edges of glittering rooms filled with chandeliers and champagne, my modest suit looking drab against their silk and gold. Rebecca would glide past me, her hand looped through his arm, laughing too loudly at his stories. If she acknowledged me at all, it was with a brief nod, the kind you'd give to a stranger you barely recognized. One night I overheard her whisper to a friend, "He tries, but you know, he doesn't really fit in." The words stung more than I can describe. I had fit into every sleepless night, every overdue bill, every sacrifice that kept her dreams alive, but now, in her new world, I was out of place. She stopped asking about my health, my work, my life. Conversations turned into transactions. Quick updates, short acknowledgments, polite dismissals. The warmth that once defined her voice toward me was gone, replaced by a cool distance, as if the bond between us had been slowly cut away, thread by thread. And through it all, I stayed silent, because silence was easier than admitting the truth. Rebecca was not just drifting from me, she was learning to live without me, to erase me, and every smile she gave to Nathaniel was proof that I was being replaced, not only in her heart, but in her story. Nathaniel's poison worked quietly, like frost creeping over glass. I could see it in the way Rebecca's eyes shifted whenever I spoke, a flicker of impatience, a trace of embarrassment. He had convinced her that I was outdated, clinging to her like a relic of the past. And she believed him. Holidays once sacred to us dissolved into excuses. Christmas dinners were postponed, then abandoned. Birthdays passed with nothing more than a text, often sent late at night, as though even the act of remembering me was a chore. I would sit at the kitchen table, a candle burning low, waiting for the sound of her footsteps at the door that never came. There was one Thanksgiving I will never forget. I cooked the meal myself, turkey, stuffing, even her favorite pumpkin pie. The table was set, the wine uncorked. Hours passed in silence until I realized no one was coming. When I finally reached her, her voice was casual, almost irritated. "Dad, we had plans with Nathaniel's family. Didn't I tell you?" The pie grew cold on the counter. My heart did too. Loneliness settled into the corners of my home like dust. I told myself it was temporary, that she would come back to me once the newness of her world wore off. But deep down, I knew better. Nathaniel had given her something intoxicating, a sense of belonging in a glittering circle, and to maintain it, she had to cast me out. Every empty chair, every silent phone call, every holiday passed alone was proof. I was no longer her father in practice, only in name. And even that name, I feared, would not last much longer. The station scene replays in my mind, over and over, like a verdict I can't appeal. Each time I see her face, the cold certainty in her eyes, the way her words cut without hesitation. But now, through the lens of all I sacrificed, the wound is sharper. I see myself sitting by her bedside when fever made her body tremble, whispering stories until sleep found her. I see the apartment key I pressed into her hand, knowing it cost me the roof I had promised to rebuild for myself. I see the car, the stamps, the late nights, the choices that carved away my future so hers could glow. Every image piles into the silence of that station, and the weight is unbearable. She stood before me not as the little girl who once begged me never to leave, but as a stranger who demanded my disappearance. One sentence, spoken in front of strangers and flashing phones, erased decades of devotion. The applause of trains pulling into the platform sounded like mockery. The snow falling through the glass roof seemed like ashes drifting from a fire I could never reignite. I realized betrayal is not a sudden blade. It is a lifetime of sacrifices dismissed in an instant, 1,000 gifts erased by a single act of cruelty. And standing there, frozen in the crowd, I understood the truth. My daughter had not only rejected me from her wedding, she had buried me from her life. The scar of that moment would not fade. It would harden, and though I said nothing then, silence has its own power. A father's silence can become the sharpest weapon of all. Grief has a way of filling a room, of pressing against the walls until breathing feels like labor. In the days after the station, I wandered my home like a ghost. Her words clung to me, poisoning every quiet corner. Yet one night, when sleep refused me, I returned to the habits that had once defined me. I pulled the old case files from my shelves, dust coating my hands, and began to read. Not for work, not for clients, simply to remember who I had been before I was reduced to nothing more than a discarded father. It was there, in the brittle pages of old contracts and settlement agreements, that I found the first thread. A forgotten deal shares quietly granted to me decades ago when I helped broker a merger between two rising firms. At the time, the value was modest, barely worth the ink on the certificate. But the company had grown, expanded, evolved, and now those same shares placed me as a silent but significant stakeholder in the empire Nathaniel so proudly paraded as his own. My hands trembled as I traced the signatures, my own name etched in fading ink. Rebecca had spoken of me as a failure, a relic, a man with nothing to offer. Yet here, buried in dust and memory, was proof that I still held power she could neither erase nor ignore. The empire that had given her the courage to spit me out of her life was, in part, built on foundations that carried my mark. For the first time since the station, the weight on my chest shifted. Not gone, never gone, but lighter, because grief had whispered, I was powerless. The documents in my hand told a different story. Once the discovery was made, I could not stop. Old instincts stirred awake, sharp and methodical. I began cross-referencing the annual reports with the public filings, tracing numbers the way a surgeon traces arteries. At first it felt like habit, like stretching muscles long neglected. But then patterns emerged, and habit became revelation. Numbers don't lie unless someone tells them to. And Nathaniel's numbers screamed deception. Profits inflated beyond reason, expenses buried in vague accounts. Shell companies spun like spiderwebs, siphoning funds from one ledger into another. Every page I examined whispered fraud, louder and louder, until it was no longer a suspicion but a certainty. I set aside my grief and took notes with precision. Dates, amounts, signatures, inconsistencies. The evidence piled up in neat, damning stacks. Nathaniel and his circle weren't merely reckless, they were orchestrating a theater of success, dressing rot in gold and selling it as triumph. Rebecca's name appeared too, not always directly, but tied to the flow of money. Her company, the one I had once sacrificed everything to keep afloat, was now entangled in these schemes. Whether knowingly or by willful blindness, she was part of the machine. My chest ached as I stared at her name in black ink. I wanted to believe she was innocent, that the girl I raised could not sink so low. But innocence and ignorance are not the same, and silence in the face of corruption is guilt in its own right. The betrayal at the station had been personal, this was larger, this was criminal, and in my hands lay the proof strong enough to bring down their empire. The deeper I dug, the more Rebecca's shadow stretched across the pages. Her company was not merely linked by chance, it was tethered, knotted into the fabric of Nathaniel's schemes. Payments routed through her accounts, contracts signed under her letterhead, partnerships that funneled money into the same shell corporations Nathaniel used to disguise his theft. The truth bled from the ink. She was not just a spectator, she was a beneficiary. I wanted to slam the folder shut, to preserve the last fragments of my belief that she was simply misguided, caught in Nathaniel's orbit. But the documents refused me that mercy. Each one carried her signature, her approval, her silence turned into profit. She had chosen not to see what was obvious, and in law, willful blindness is as damning as intent. For hours I sat at my desk, her name staring back at me from contracts I had once dreamed of seeing adorned with her triumphs. My mind replayed the sacrifices the car sold, the stamps gone, the sleepless nights all so she could rise. And now, here she was, rising on corruption, standing taller because others had been trampled beneath her ambition. A father's heart begs for excuses. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe Nathaniel forced her hand. Maybe the smile on her face when she signed those papers was a mask. But the evidence was clear, and the law does not bend for love. I felt something shift inside me, grief hardening into resolve. Betrayal had left me hollow, but truth had given me something stronger than sorrow. Purpose. Nights turned into rituals. I would sit at my desk with a single lamp burning, the rest of the house swallowed in darkness, and comb through files until my eyes blurred. The steady scratch of my pen on yellow legal pads was the only sound in the room. I wrote dates, cross-referenced figures, noted every discrepancy with the care of a man preparing a closing argument he could never lose. It felt almost unnatural how easily the rhythm returned. Years ago, I had walked out of that life, trading the courtroom for fatherhood, prestige for presence. Yet now, with betrayal pressing against my ribs, the instincts came alive as though they had only been sleeping. Each discovery sent a jolt through me, anger, sorrow, but also a strange clarity. I printed documents, highlighted trails of fraud, mapped connections between shell companies and executives. I built binders, neat rows of evidence that grew heavier by the night. My office began to look less like a study and more like a war room. The smell of ink and paper replaced the warmth of home. I barely noticed the cold anymore. I only felt the fire in my chest. For years, I had been silent, eroded, diminished into a man who carried bags of sacrifice without complaint. But as I organized each page, I remembered who I was. A lawyer who had once made titans fall. A man who had wrestled with lies and torn them apart in front of juries. Betrayal had stolen my voice, but preparation was giving it back. And as the stacks of evidence grew taller, so did my resolve. I would not rush. I would not lash out. I would do what I had always done best. Build a case so strong that not even the powerful could escape it. The more I uncovered, the more monstrous the fraud revealed itself to be. Nathaniel's empire wasn't simply corrupt, it was built like a labyrinth, with walls of deception so thick most men would have turned away. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, shell corporations registered to apartments that didn't exist, fake vendors billing millions for services never rendered. It was not sloppy theft, it was systemic, engineered with precision and arrogance. Rebecca's fingerprints were lighter, but they were there. Endorsements, approvals, contracts tied to her company's growth. She wasn't orchestrating the crime, no. Nathaniel was the conductor, but she played her part in the orchestra. And to me, that was enough. Guilt isn't measured only by the hand that steals, but also by the eyes that look away. I stacked the binders in rows across my desk, each one heavier than the last. I read them until the words blurred, then read them again. I told myself this wasn't revenge, not yet. It was truth. Truth written in numbers and signatures, truth that could outlive the lies they had built. At times, sorrow pierced through the resolve. I remembered Rebecca at 10 years old, clapping for me at a school career day, proud to say her father was a lawyer who fought for justice. What would she say now, if she knew I was fighting against her? Did she remember those words? Did she remember me at all? The ache was sharp, but clarity was sharper. Justice does not bow to blood. Betrayal had already killed the father I had been. What remained was the lawyer, and the lawyer would not rest until the empire crumbled. Caution became my closest ally. I knew better than to strike all at once. Empires do not collapse from a single blow, they crumble from pressure applied in the right places. So I tested the ground. I prepared a small leak, carefully chosen documents that pointed to inconsistencies but did not yet reveal the whole truth. I mailed them anonymously to a journalist whose integrity I trusted, a man who had once quoted my closing arguments in the press. Within a week, whispers began to circulate. A short column buried in the finance section hinted at irregularities in Nathaniel's accounts. Another outlet speculated about missing funds. The rumors spread like cracks through ice. Nathaniel's name, once untouchable, now carried a shadow. I watched his televised interviews, his smile a little tighter, his words a little faster, his confidence chipped by invisible hands. I knew the taste of fear on a man's face, and Nathaniel was beginning to wear it. Rebecca, too. At a gala, captured in photographs that later surfaced online, her eyes darted toward the cameras with unease. The world that once applauded her now tilted its head, suspicious. The applause was no longer pure, it carried hesitation. The satisfaction I felt was not joy. It was confirmation. The evidence was strong enough to wound, even in fragments. And if whispers could shake them, the storm I held in reserve would break them beyond repair. I returned to my study each night with renewed resolve. The binders were no longer just evidence. They were weapons. And patience, I reminded myself, was the deadliest blade I had ever wielded. By the time the final pieces slid into place, I was no longer the broken man from the train station. I was steady, sharpened by purpose. The binders on my desk had grown into an arsenal, each one a weapon forged from truth. I sealed them in envelopes, labeled and numbered, ready for the hands of regulators, journalists, and judges. I made copies, hid them in places even I could forget, ensuring that no threat, no silence, could bury what I had uncovered. In those quiet nights, I rehearsed every possibility. The law had always been a battlefield, and I knew its rules better than Nathaniel ever would. I traced timelines, anticipated defenses, mapped out counterarguments until exhaustion blurred the ink. But beneath it all, one thought pulsed steady. I was not doing this to destroy him. I was doing this to restore balance, to remind the world that wealth cannot purchase innocence. Rebecca haunted every page. Her signature stared back at me, mocking, pleading, damning, all at once. I grieved for her in silence, the daughter I raised, the child who once clutched my sleeve, erased now by ambition. But grief did not paralyze me anymore. It steeled me. When I finally closed the last binder, locking it with a snap that echoed in the stillness, I knew the path ahead. The world would see their empire for what it truly was. And when it all fell, I would not raise my voice in triumph, nor offer comfort in defeat. I would stand silent, as I had at the station, letting the truth speak louder than blood ever could. The first strike had to be silent, precise, not a roar, but a whisper that could not be ignored. I prepared a dossier of the cleanest evidence: falsified audits, forged vendor agreements, wire transfers to shell companies. Enough to spark suspicion, not yet enough to topple the walls. I sent it, through channels I trusted, directly into the hands of regulators who knew how to smell blood in the water. Then I waited. Waiting was something I had learned well in courtrooms, in negotiations, in life. The silence stretched for weeks, but beneath that silence, the current shifted. Letters were issued. Investigators whispered questions in the right corridors. By the time the story broke, Nathaniel's empire had already begun to tremble. I watched his face on the evening news, his confident smile faltering as a reporter asked about irregularities in financial disclosures. He brushed it off, of course. Men like him always do at first, mistaking scrutiny for rumor. But I saw it, the tightening of his jaw, the glimmer of panic in his eyes. The first crack in the marble facade. Rebecca stood beside him in the photographs, her arm looped through his, but her eyes betrayed unease. She had built her life on the illusion of permanence, and now that illusion flickered under the heat of truth. The world still applauded, but softer now, as if uncertain whether the stage would collapse beneath their feet. For me, there was no applause, no celebration, only quiet resolve. The law does not rush. Justice is patient. And patience, I reminded myself, had always been my sharpest weapon. When the headlines came, they arrived like thunder after distant lightning. Major conglomerate under scrutiny for financial fraud. Anonymous documents suggest systemic corruption. The whispers I had planted now roared across front pages, spilling into evening broadcasts, climbing the walls of boardrooms that once looked down on me with disdain. Journalists dissected the numbers, analysts speculated about missing millions, and television hosts debated the fall of a dynasty. Shareholders panicked. Investors pulled their money like gamblers fleeing a burning casino. The stock price tumbled day after day, digits bleeding red across the ticker screens. Nathaniel's carefully curated empire was unraveling before the world's eyes. I watched it all from my armchair, the news anchor's voice filling the silence of my home. There was no joy in me, only a strange, cold clarity. This was not vengeance. It was exposure. The truth I had stacked, page upon page, was now too loud to be ignored. Cameras caught Nathaniel storming past reporters, his jaw tight, sweat shining under the flashbulbs. Rebecca walked behind him, her chin lifted, but the defiance in her stride couldn't mask the fear flickering in her gaze. She was learning what it meant to build a life on sand and to watch the tide come in. The world had finally seen the cracks. And once cracks appear, collapse is no longer a question of if, but when. The collapse came not with a single explosion, but with the steady silence of doors closing one after another. Allies who once toasted Nathaniel in crystal halls now withdrew without farewell. Business partners canceled meetings. Politicians who had praised his vision erased his name from speeches. In the world of power, loyalty is a currency that vanishes the moment its value dips. Rebecca felt it too. Invitations to galas stopped arriving. Friends who had once crowded around her table now kept their distance. Even her closest confidantes avoided her calls, afraid to be linked to scandal. She had built her identity on belonging to that glittering circle, and now the circle shrank until she stood alone. I watched from the quiet of my study as the empire rotted from within. Their names, once gilded, became subjects of ridicule whispered in news columns and dinner parties. The same mouths that once praised them now spat rumors with delight. Betrayal tastes familiar at every level of society. Nathaniel raged in boardrooms, his voice leaking through unnamed sources, blaming everyone but himself. Rebecca, pale in the photographs, stood beside him with a hollow smile that fooled no one. They had mocked me as a relic, a burden, a shadow. Now they were the shadows shrinking, fading, unseen. The silence of abandonment was the truest verdict of all. For years, I had stood alone in the snow, humiliated before strangers. Now, it was their turn to stand alone, stripped of allies, while the world moved on without them. The day after the headlines reached their peak, I prepared the final stroke. I had no desire to profit from the empire's ashes. Wealth was never the prize. Justice was. I signed the papers that transferred every share I held into an anonymous trust, sealed beyond their reach. No one could accuse me of personal gain. My hands would remain clean, untethered to the ruin that was coming. Then I sent the complete dossier, not the fragments, not the whispers, but the entire storm, hundreds of pages documenting false accounts, bribed auditors, forged signatures, and contracts that tied Nathaniel's name to crimes no court could overlook. I delivered it to the regulatory board, to federal investigators, and to the very law firm that had once called me partner. A message to all of them. The truth is here, undeniable, unstoppable. The binders left my study in sealed boxes, carried by couriers who never knew my name. Watching them disappear down the steps, I felt an odd stillness. For years, I had been diminished into silence, mocked as irrelevant. Yet with a single act, I had set in motion something far larger than myself. The case would not just cripple a family, it would cleanse an entire institution rotting from the inside. When I closed the door that evening, the house seemed quieter than ever. Not empty, not lonely, but resolved. I had given them my life, and they had thrown me into the snow. Now, I had given the world their truth. Whatever came next, I would meet it with steady hands. The summons arrived quickly, faster than even I had anticipated. News cameras swarmed the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted over each other, and the air buzzed with the scent of scandal. Nathaniel's name, once carved into marble and etched on magazine covers, now hung in the air like a curse. And beside him, Rebecca, my daughter, pale, trembling, but still clinging to his arm as though it could shield her from the truth. I did not sit in the front rows of the courtroom. I chose the back, where shadows offered me anonymity. I did not need the spotlight, nor the satisfaction of confrontation. All I needed was to hear the evidence spoken aloud, to see justice unfold as it was meant to. Page by page, the prosecutors revealed the rot. Fraudulent ledgers, falsified audits, witness statements from insiders who had turned in desperation to save themselves. Every revelation tightened the noose. Nathaniel's face flushed red, then ashen. His lawyers fumbled. His voice cracked in denials that fooled no one. And Rebecca, she could not meet the judge's eyes. She stared at the table in front of her, lips pressed into a thin line, as if the weight of her silence over the years had finally come crashing down. For me, there was no triumph, no glee, only a quiet stillness, as though the world had finally remembered how to balance itself. The humiliation of the station, the loneliness of the empty holidays, the sting of being erased, all of it echoed here, transformed into evidence, into truth, into justice. And I sat, steady and silent, watching the empire collapse not by my hand, but by the law's tores. The pressure mounted until Nathaniel cracked. I saw it in the twitch of his jaw, the way his polished confidence dissolved under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. His lawyers whispered frantically, sliding papers across the table, but no strategy could untangle the web of evidence laid before the judge. He lashed out instead, first at the press, then at the prosecutors, finally at Rebecca herself. The empire that once made him untouchable was now eating him alive. Rebecca sat frozen, her knuckles white around the edge of the table, For years she had worn her pride like armor, parading through ballrooms as if my sacrifices were nothing more than dust beneath her heels. But in that room, with the weight of justice pressing down, the mask cracked. She looked smaller, diminished, a woman who had built her life on illusions, now stripped bare in front of the world. I kept to my silence. Every instinct as a father screamed to speak, to comfort, to reach for the child I once carried through storms. But the man at that table was not the child I raised, and the woman she had become was not innocent. Compassion had no place here. The court belonged to truth, not sentiment. The judge's questions cut sharper than any blade. Nathaniel stammered. Rebecca flinched. Their empire bled credibility by the minute. I sat still, hands folded, my face unreadable. I was not there to destroy them. They had done that themselves. I was there only to bear witness, to watch justice claim what betrayal had sown. The courtroom grew colder with every charge read aloud. Fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement. Words that rang like hammers on stone, shattering the image Nathaniel had built for himself and dragging Rebecca down with him. The prosecutors laid it all bare, the forged audits, the phantom vendors, the siphoned millions. Each detail was another nail in the coffin of their empire. Nathaniel tried to fight. His voice rose, his hands slammed against the table, but rage cannot erase ink. His protests were drowned out by the steady cadence of the judge, who spoke with the authority of the law itself. Every denial sounded more desperate, every excuse more hollow. Rebecca did not fight. She sat in silence, eyes lowered, her lips trembling as though the truth had finally reached her. Once, she had been the girl who begged me never to leave. Now she was a woman learning what it meant to be left behind by the very world she had chosen over me. I did not rejoice. There was no smile on my face, no satisfaction in my chest. Justice is not a celebration, it is a reckoning. The humiliation of the station, the years of loneliness, the weight of betrayal, none of it disappeared with the sound of the gavel, but it transformed. The pain became evidence, the silence became testimony, and in the end, the law spoke for me. When the judge declared the trial would proceed with full charges, the air shifted. Nathaniel sagged in his chair, Rebecca's shoulders shook, and I, in the back row, finally exhaled. Not in triumph, but in release. The balance had be. When the session ended, the courtroom emptied into a storm of cameras and flashing lights. Nathaniel stumbled through the crowd, barking at reporters, his once practiced charm replaced by frantic denial. Rebecca followed behind, her face pale, her eyes searching, and for the first time in years, they searched for me. I rose from my seat in the back row, the leather of the bench creaking beneath me, and walked toward the exit. The air smelled of sweat, paper, and the faint trace of fear. As I passed the aisle, I heard her voice break the silence. Dad. Just one word, fragile, cracked open by desperation. I did not stop. I did not turn. My steps were steady, measured, the echo of my shoes on marble louder than her plea. I had nothing left to give her, no comfort, no forgiveness, no hand to hold in her fall. Betrayal had burned those bridges to ash, and ash cannot be rebuilt. Outside, the crowd swarmed, microphones thrust forward, voices shouting questions. I walked through them without a word, the cold air biting against my face. Snowflakes drifted from the gray sky, settling on my shoulders like a shroud. For years they had written me out of their story, casting me as a relic, a failure, a ghost. Now justice had given me the final word, not spoken but lived. And as I disappeared into the snowfall, leaving Rebecca's voice swallowed by the crowd behind me, I understood the truth. Silence was the only answer she would ever receive. The house was quiet when I returned, as it always was, yet something in the silence had changed. It no longer pressed against me like loneliness. It rested, calm, like a verdict delivered and done. I hung my coat, set my suitcase by the door, and walked into the study where the lamp still glowed over the empty desk. The binders were gone now, delivered into hands that would carry them farther than I ever could. What remained was only stillness. Outside, snow fell heavy against the window, the same as the day she had cast me out on the station platform. But I no longer felt the sting of it. The cold had lost its bite. I had faced betrayal, carried its weight, and placed it before the law. My part was finished. I sank into my armchair, the leather groaning under my weight, and breathed deeply for the first time in years. There was no triumph in me, no victory cry, only peace, quiet, steady peace that spread through my chest like warmth after a storm. The humiliation I once thought eternal had been transformed, not erased, but rewritten into something I could live with. I was not forgotten. I was not powerless. I had shown them, and myself, that truth endures even when love does not. And in that truth I found the closest thing to freedom a betrayed father could ever hold. I walked to the mantel and lifted the photograph that had waited there for years, my wife's smile frozen in time, her eyes full of a warmth the world could never steal. I carried it to the desk and set it beside me, the glass cool beneath my fingertips. For a long while I simply stared, as though speaking to her in silence. "I did what was right," I whispered at last. The words broke softly into the room, a confession, a prayer, a vow fulfilled. She had always believed in justice, in the law's ability to reveal the truth when lies had poisoned everything. I had doubted, faltered, nearly let grief smother me, but tonight I had honored her faith. The house did not feel empty with her photo beside me. It felt whole, complete in a way Rebecca's betrayal could no longer undo. Betrayal may wound, but it does not have the final word. Justice does. And with her smile watching over me, I felt that justice was not just a verdict against Nathaniel and Rebecca, it was a restoration of who I was. A husband who had loved, a father who had given, a man who had stood for truth, even when truth cut through his own flesh. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the world in silence. But inside, I was not alone. My wife's memory remained, steady as the light of the lamp, and in that memory I found a companion stronger than betrayal, stronger than blood. The phone rang the next morning. Its shrill cry broke the quiet, pulling me from the calm I had built in the night. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before I finally lifted the receiver. Her voice trembled through the line, "Rebecca." For a heartbeat, I almost didn't recognize it. The pride was gone, the sharpness dulled. What remained was desperation. "Dad, can we talk?" she whispered. The same word she had once used at the courthouse, the same fragile plea that had trailed me into the snow. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I saw her at 10 years old, clutching my sleeve, begging me not to leave her bedside. But that child no longer existed. The woman on the line had chosen silence, complicity, betrayal. My hand tightened around the receiver. 1,000 words rose in my throat, memories and questions and the ache of a lifetime. But I said nothing. I lowered the receiver back onto its cradle and let the silence swallow her voice. That silence was not cruelty. It was truth. Because some wounds are not healed by words. Some bonds, once broken, cannot be mended. And forgiveness was never mine to give. Justice had already spoken. My duty was finished. The phone sat quiet after that, the house returning to its calm. I stood by the window, watching snow drift over the street, and understood. The final gift I could give my daughter was absence. The absence she demanded at the station, the absence she had carved into our lives. This time, I chose it for mine. In the weeks that followed, I turned my focus away from the wreckage of their downfall and towards something new, something lasting. The wealth I had once guarded, the remnants of the sacrifices I had stored, I redirected. Not to Rebecca, not to Nathaniel, not to a family that had spit me out into the snow. I created scholarships in my wife's name, funds for children whose dreams hung on the edge of impossibility. I sent quiet donations to shelters, to veterans, to causes that echoed the values I had lived by but too often set aside. Each act of giving felt different now. It was no longer sacrifice made for one person's ambition. It was investment in a future wider than blood, stronger than betrayal. For the first time in years, my generosity didn't feel like erosion. It felt like building, like planting seeds in soil that would remember. Letters began to arrive. Handwritten notes from students who would now attend college, from mothers who could keep their children fed through winter, from veterans who found shelter on nights colder than any courtroom marble. They didn't know my story, and they didn't need to. Their gratitude was enough, quiet, genuine, untainted. I pinned those letters to the walls of my study where the binders once stood, proof that my legacy was not tied to Rebecca's betrayal, but to choices that gave life where she had chosen silence. In giving beyond her, I had found freedom from her. And freedom, I realized, was the only inheritance worth leaving behind. Whispers travel fast in a city that feeds on reputation. At first, I heard them only in fragments, a neighbor mentioning my name with respect, a colleague from decades past sending a letter of quiet admiration. Then more came. Invitations to speak at universities, requests for counsel from young lawyers who had studied my cases. I had not sought these things, but they arrived, as though the world itself was remembering what my daughter had tried to erase. The irony was sharp. At the station, no one had spoken for me. No one had lifted a hand in my defense. But now, after silence and humiliation, after years of being unseen, respect returned not because I demanded it, but because truth had forced the world to look again. The same people who once turned their eyes away now spoke of courage, of integrity, of justice served. I did not bask in it. I accepted their words with the same calm I carried into courtrooms long ago. Respect is not a balm for betrayal. It is simply recognition of what was always there. I had been the same man at the station as I was now. The difference was that the truth, once hidden, had been laid bare. Still, there was comfort in it. To walk the streets without shame, to hear my name spoken without pity, to know that my story had not ended in silence but in vindication, these were gifts I had not expected. And though I carried the scars of betrayal, I no longer carried the weight of invisibility. The world saw me again. That was enough. Rebecca's name faded from the headlines as quickly as it had flared. The scandal that once made her infamous was replaced by fresher tragedies, newer downfalls. Society has no loyalty to the fallen. Nathaniel's empire was sold off in fragments, his allies scattered to protect themselves. And Rebecca, she became a ghost in the city she once ruled. Occasionally, I would glimpse her face in a tabloid photograph, walking alone, head down, a shadow of the woman who once stood proud in the spotlight. There were no diamonds on her hand now, no crowds at her side, just a silence that mirrored the one she had demanded for me on that snowy platform. I did not seek her out. I did not curse her name. I simply let her fade, because there is no punishment sharper than obscurity for someone who built their life on being seen. The world moved on, and so did I. My days filled with letters from students, evenings with books I had long neglected, mornings with the quiet company of memory. Her absence no longer ached. It simply was like a scar one no longer feels until the weather changes. In her erasure, I found a final lesson. Betrayal can wound, can hollow, can scar, but it cannot define unless you allow it. I chose not to. And so Rebecca became what she had once demanded of me, invisible. The courthouse steps were slick with melting snow the day the final ruling was handed down. Nathaniel's name was ruined, his empire dismantled, his legacy nothing more than a cautionary tale. Rebecca stood apart from him now, silent, her face pale beneath the gray sky. I did not wait for the cameras or the noise. I lingered only long enough to hear the gavel fall, to know that the story had closed where it began with truth. As I stepped outside, snow drifted gently through the air, settling on my shoulders, my coat, my hair. The same snow that had once borne witness to my humiliation now bore witness to my freedom. I paused, breathing it in, feeling the sting on my skin, and for the first time in years it did not hurt. It felt clean. Behind me, Rebecca's voice carried faintly, calling my name. Once I would have turned. Once I would have given everything to answer. But not now, not anymore. Her voice belonged to the past, and I had no need to chase echoes. I walked down the steps, past the microphones, past the questions, past the chaos. Each step was steady, each breath lighter than the last. I did not look back. I did not forgive. I did not explain. I simply moved forward into the snowfall. This isn't revenge, Rebecca, I whispered to the wind. This is justice. And with those words, I vanished into the white, leaving the past behind me forever.